All right. Last week we started on the second part of Revelation 13 notes. We nearly finished chapter 13 last week, but we remember the first part of chapter 13, verses 1 through 10, we have the first beast that it arose up out of the sea, and as it's being described how that it served the dragon, and certainly the different elements involved kind of show forth, especially as we talk about the individuals who worship the beast and therefore they worship the dragon, and describes, especially there in verse 10, what Rome was doing to the saints, how that they were leading into captivity, they were killing with the sword, but that's going to come back on them. God is going to bring retribution back upon and punishment upon the empire. But then here in verse 11, that second beast, this one arises out of the earth. It's very demonic. It's of the earth. It's of the realm of Satan and of the dragon. And we notice how he had two horns like a lamb, spoke like a dragon. Remember, lambs, they don't have horns. Rams do, and certainly the head of, or the two horns of rams are associated with idolatry and idol worship. But this is kind of given this imagery of this kind of docile and innocent nature while having basically these horns of idolatry. And then, of course, the speaking like a dragon. Certainly there's that imagery of, here's a little tiny lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. But I also think there's a direct connection to Revelation 12 with regard to that dragon being Satan, and the fact that this is from Satan. This is something that Satan is involved in, and certainly this speaks directly to the idol worship, and perhaps even more specifically, emperor worship that was taking place, especially in the time of Domitian, which is when John is writing all of this. And we see there in verse 13 how that he performs great signs, but are these signs real miracles? No. In fact, in verse 14, he deceives those who dwell on the earth. They're fake. They're not genuine power, or it's not genuine power. It's very similar to what we have with the example of Simon the sorcerer, and how even Simon, who he faked his power, but when he saw the power of Philip, what did he realize? This is real. This is real power. This isn't fake. This isn't some kind of trick or deception. This is real. And certainly there in verse 14, the recognition that this beast, again, and this seems to be indicative of idolatry and those who served idols, that would be the priesthood of these false gods, the priestesses of these false gods, that whole kind of intertwined structure of religious worship of these idols and of the Caesars themselves that were intertwined in the government of Rome. And then in verse 15, he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. And again, whether we're talking about specifically images of the Caesars, of the emperors, and certainly, and especially with Domitian, although there were certainly statues prior to Domitian of the different emperors, but it was kind of a progression, a gradual increase in terms of, at first it was something of honor, as statues are often made in honor of someone, but then gradually it became more and more an object of worship, to the point that it was then eventually these statues of the emperors, it was enforced among the Roman Empire that the citizens worship the image of the emperor. So whether we're talking specifically emperor worship or any of the images of the false gods would certainly apply as well. And then we saw in verse 16 how that he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads. And this is in contrast to the mark of the 144,000 that we read about back in chapter 7. And how that God, he wanted to make sure to seal those who belonged to him, those who were righteous and pure, who obeyed faithfully. They received a mark. And we're going to find in chapter 14 that mark was the name of the Father and of the Son. That was that mark, meaning these are mine. They serve me. They're not going to be hurt or harmed by the punishment that's coming upon, especially as it's pertaining to Rome here. That I'm not going to pour out that judgment on them because they serve me. But I think it's notable, and I thought this was a really good point that Bob Harkrider brings out in his commentary. He mentions whatever signs Satan has attempted to duplicate have only been counterfeit, as Moses proved before Pharaoh. And remember, we talked a little bit about the magicians of Pharaoh and how that they tried to copy some of the early miracles and the signs of the plagues, but then after a certain point they couldn't. Even they had to acknowledge this is the finger of God. We can't do this. But then Homer Haley mentions in his commentary, if God allowed Satan to deceive by genuine miracles, he would thereby nullify his own witness to truth. Remember, Jesus himself acknowledged, listen, don't just take my word for it. The things that I do, if they are from God or not, you judge. In fact, Nicodemus, when he came to Jesus in John 3, he said no one could do these things except he be from God. And certainly the man who was born blind and then was healed, even he testified before the Sanhedrin that it's never ever been heard of that anyone born blind could be made whole. And so if the whole point is the fact that Jesus and God, the idea of these miracles, both by Jesus himself as well as the apostles, it was intended to convey that seal of approval, that power of God, and that the words that they speak were confirmed by those miracles. And Homer points out the fact that if God allowed Satan to deceive by genuine power, then that would be a kind of a conflict in allowing God's power to shine through instead of Satan's power. He mentions the difference between the deceptions of Satan and the true miracles of God is clearly set forth in the contrast between the sorceries of Simon and the signs of Philip in Acts chapter 8. And I thought that was a really good point. But also under this point about the statue, I thought this was interesting. Under Trajan, who ultimately became Caesar after Domitian died, or after Domitian was removed, under Trajan started in 98 AD, and he reigned for about 20 years as Caesar. There's a clear reference to empire-wide prosecution of Christians. Writing from Pontus around 112 AD, so that would be around 15 to 20 years after Revelation was written, Pliny the Younger reported to Trajan that the contagion, that's what he called Christianity, the contagion of Christianity threatened everyone, regardless of gender, age, or rank. And Pliny gave those accused of being Christians the opportunity to deny it, and those who wouldn't deny Christianity, he executed. Any who cursed Christ or recited a prayer to the gods or to Trajan's statue were released. And Pliny acknowledged that these were things that those who are really Christians cannot be made to do. And I thought that was a really excellent quote, that this is from Pliny the Younger. He's writing and he's reporting on this effort against Christianity to Trajan. And he said those who are truly Christians, they can't be made to recant. They can't be made, no matter how much we torture them, how much we threaten them, they won't curse Christianity, they won't recant worship or serve the emperor in that sense. So I thought that was a really interesting contrast, especially given the kind of the context that we're dealing with, those who do not worship the image of the beast. This goes back to that first beast. And again, that's the empire, okay, as a whole, and the empire is designating the service of these false gods as well as the worship of these emperors. And so again, this mark of verse 16 is in contrast then to chapter 14. If chapter 14, the name or the mark that the 144,000 received was the name of the Father and of the Son, marking them as being those that belong to God who served him faithfully, then what's the opposite of that then? That would be the mark being referenced here. Either we serve God or we serve whom? Satan. Okay, and John makes no bones about it in 1 John chapter 3. Either we're children of God or we're children of the devil. And so this is the contrast here between the marks that are being referred to. Notice it's in their right hand or in their foreheads, but it's the idea of something that is visible. Okay, and even today, what hand do we typically shake with? A right hand. Okay, even people who are left-handed generally shake with their right hand. And even in the Old Testament, there's references to the right hand of power. Okay, it's not a statement of left-handed or right-handed. Always the right hand represented something in the ancient world. And it's certainly when people extended the right hand of fellowship or they extended a greeting, that right hand could be clearly seen, just like something written on somebody's forehead could be clearly seen. And that's why it says on their right hand or on their foreheads. It's not that it's specific to some physical mark. This isn't anything specific physically. It's that this is clearly notable. It's clearly seen, just as those who are serving God, can that be clearly seen when the empire looks at them, looks at Christians? We just read the fact that those who are truly Christians can't be made to recant. Okay, they stand out. They're different from everybody else, and certainly they're being executed and brought before judges and so forth in the times of Pliny the Younger. Well, this is the same concept is true in that those who are serving Jehovah, they're different from everybody else who serves Satan. And they have in their life basically the mark of Satan, which is sin, specifically applied here of idolatry, but ultimately whether I serve specifically the emperor or serve a false god or serve myself, okay, can my own happiness be an idol? My own desires could be an idol. Okay, receiving or trying to have as much stuff in this world as I can get can be an idol. I mean, so just because we're talking about false gods here, that could be applied in any way that could draw somebody away from serving God the way they ought to. And that carries with it, well, quote unquote, the mark of the beast. And that's why in verse 17, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. The idea, remember when we talked a little bit about this with regard to some of these churches of Asia and how that some of these cities in Asia had guilds that were directly associated with the worship of these false gods. And in order to do business, if you were a business person in these cities, you had to participate in these libations, in pouring out sacrifices to these false gods. And if you didn't do that, then you couldn't do business in those places. Okay, so this is, certainly there's a sense of those being killed, but even those who somehow are able to escape notice or escape being killed, is there still going to be some kind of physical repercussion? Yes. Okay, even these places where maybe there isn't a specific effort to purge Christians in this particular community or city, certainly these guilds are not going to be associated with anybody who isn't serving or at least isn't doing what the empire tells them to do, whether it's true devotion to a false god or not. At least go through the motions so you can do business, so that the economy can continue. And yet even Christians are going to be affected even by the economic situation because they're not going to be approved of in the empire because they don't go along with what everybody else does. And so their jobs are going to be affected. Their ability to do business is going to be affected. And again, notice, unless you have that mark on your right hand or your forehead, unless it's something that's obvious. And again, this seems to especially designate the idea that you're not going out of your way to make those sacrifices to the gods, or to, for instance, having that certificate that we talked about with the 7 churches, having that certificate once a year that most Roman citizens were required to have to say that I have offered up my homage and sacrifice to Caesar for the year. And they received a certificate saying that they had done that for the year, and that was their loyalty to the Lord Emperor has been satisfied. Well, here in verse 17, no one can buy or sell. No one is going to do business with somebody who doesn't have that mark. And the whole idea here is that these Christians are fine with that. If that means having to go through economic hardship because we have the mark of God, of the one true God, of the name of the Father and of the Son on our foreheads, and we're unwilling to substitute that with the mark of the beast, that's okay. Okay, if they're not going to do business with us, that's fine. And I think that kind of goes back to that Pliny the Younger's point about those who are truly Christians. We can't force them, we can't make them recant. They refuse to, so we put them to death. Because unless they are willing to recant and do what we tell them to do, well, we're not going to have anything to do with them. All right, so any thought through verse 17?
This is just a weird perspective, but just to share that there are people around us and in our families that
Yeah.
My cousin told me a few weeks ago that it's all about the chip going in the hand and that governments will not let us buy or sell without us having a chip. And I said, I don't think that has anything to do with 2024. But I'm glad we discussed this today because because it is a visible sign.
Yeah.
I'm not going to know if somebody has a chip. So this is one argument. But there are people that truly believe this is the mark of the beast. We're all going to have to get chipped. The government is going to...
Well, and to be completely honest, this is not new. People have been trying to take Revelation and apply it to their specific generation for 2,000 years. Okay, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, there was I forget the name of the book, but it tried to apply, you remember the numbers that the Germans gave the Jews during the Holocaust that were tattooed on them? There were people who tried to associate that to the mark of the beast versus the mark of God, of the 144,000. I mean, there have been attempts all throughout the ages to try to make some physical construct or physical element of Revelation apply to their specific time. And there's varied reasons why people try to do this, but I think to a certain extent, all of them kind of come down to the same thing. A lot of these people, they want to believe the Bible, but they want to have something specific they can say, this is it. This proves the Bible's right. This is prophesied, and this is something they can point to and say, it's happening right now. And so now all of a sudden, there's going to be something that's going to happen now that's going to show us God. I mean, even the disciples at one point, show us the Father, and that'll be sufficient for us. And what did Jesus say? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Okay, it's about that character that was shining through the teaching that Jesus offered. And yet people want a physical connection to God. That's what they want. And this is why certain religions like Catholicism and Methodists and certain religions that have very specific rites and rituals and different languages like Latin are being referenced, that nobody else knows it, but it sounds holy, it feels holy, and there's this very physical connection to the worship and things like that, because they want to have that physical connection to God.
It's an emotion instead of intellectual.
It's an emotion. It's an emotional appeal. And I think with regard to Revelation, that's kind of the root of trying to take Revelation and apply it physically to either today or to last century or the century before that, in an effort to make it real, to say that this is actually happening and now God's coming or the Antichrist is coming.
There might be similarities, but you think about the author of all these problems, the devil is still working it today.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's why
and
the game plan hadn't changed.
The beauty of that, and that's a great point, what gets lost when people start trying to apply this physically throughout the generations, they look at all these things and they try to apply them physical. What do people then lose sight of? The spiritual application and the fact that Satan is using that effort to then create a mind in people that isn't focused on what the actual teaching is about. The teaching is about God is going to spare all those who are serving him. He's going to take care of them. He's going to watch over them. But all those who are wicked, what's God going to do? He's going to punish them. That is a message that, and even in our religious community, is that really a message that you hear a lot from the religious community? Not a whole lot. Okay, generally it's more like God is love and God's going to take care of everybody, and even one of the popes has said God's going to even save the atheists whether they want to be saved or not. So the idea is then that you lose sight of the fact of the goodness and severity of God. And that's one of the ways in which Satan can try to draw us in to make physical applications as if somehow that matters. Well, and throughout Revelation, what's the only thing the saints had any control over? Throughout the whole book of Revelation, what's the only thing the saints could do? Stay faithful. That's the only thing. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, all this is real and it's all physical in that sense, and it's all coming to pass right now in this year or next year. Should it change anything for you and me? Not a single thing. Even if you were to go that route, it doesn't change a single thing, because this is all about what God is doing and what God is expecting from his people, which is to be faithful unto death. God's going to take care of everything else. You be faithful unto death, Let everything else be taken care of by God. And that is the message of Revelation. It is not physical, and it is not for 2024, other than that spiritual application. Go ahead. Did I see your hand?
Yeah, going back to Satan using even the Jews back in the day of Christ, when you see that Jesus calls out the Pharisees and the scribes and Pharisees hypocrites. Why? Well, the scribes knew better. They knew the law.
Yeah.
The Pharisees, who supposedly was following the law of God, even though they went against it by their own traditions of men. But what you don't hear is a Sadducee. He doesn't call out the Sadducees as hypocrites. Why? Well, they were true to themselves what they believed, which was
there is no spiritual realm. Yeah.
No heaven. See how Satan used Israel, in changing, trying to change all that.
Yeah. 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 And you know, and we talked before, and we talked about the dragon in chapter 12. Is Satan stupid?
No.
And I think we have to be very careful that to say that in contrast to God, is Satan anything? Absolutely not. Okay, Satan's nothing compared to God. But does that mean that Satan still can't have influence on us? No. I mean, he's smart. He's intelligent. He knows Scripture, even though he takes it out of context. We have to be very, very careful, because that's exactly what ends up happening, you know, whether it's because of our own personal desires or some sense of self-justification, to twist Scripture or to twist context to make it say what we want it to say, or to make some application that we want to make out of it. Satan's not stupid. He's not going to come at us all the time with blatant things that are sinful and obviously wrong. He's going to try to sneak in between the cracks. He's going to try to sneak underneath the walls or around the walls, try to get behind it to make us think, okay, well, if we can go off a little bit, then he can take us off a little bit more. And once we've started that route, then we fall off completely. Revelation, as soon as you start taking these things and you start applying any of them to the physical realm in the sense of a physical event per se, that's when you start going off into this, you know, in the sense of events passed beyond what the audience was. Remember what John said in Revelation 1? When would these things come to pass? These things that must shortly come to pass. Okay, these are being written for people of John's time. And these are not references to some war taking place on earth here in 2024 or 25 or anything like that. All right, so then verse 18. I think it's really interesting. Remember how at the end of the first part of chapter 13, okay, there, what, verse 9? He who has an ear to hear, let him hear. Right? And that was that warning regarding, here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Is that what it says in verse, I think at the end of verse 10? Yeah, here is the patience and faith of the saints. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. That's always a reference to what? It's only used 8 times in the entire New Testament. All 8 times it's located in what book? Revelation. The other 7 times are to whom? Churches. The 7 churches of Asia. And it was always a call to listen and be very attentive to what was being said. Not that what was being said was necessarily a riddle per se, but that you have to apply spiritual wisdom to truly understand what's being said. And with those 7 churches of Asia, the application was spiritual wisdom, the Word of God. Well, here in chapter 13, the same is true. Listen to what we're saying. Listen to what the Holy Spirit's saying. Well, here in verse 18, here is wisdom. We're talking about physical wisdom, man's wisdom. See, man wants to put his wisdom into this concept of the number 666. That's what man wants to do. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. What does that mean? All right. We know that the number 7 represents what? Completion, perfection. Okay? The idea of the number 6 is not complete. It is not complete. And yet, this is looking at this from the perspective of the beast. Okay, this is looking at this from the perspective of, notice that's the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. And people try to calculate, oh, what does that mean? And how can it be the number of the beast and a number of a man? Because who are these beasts? Ultimately, in their physical form, who are both beasts? Human beings. They're human beings. Those human beings that made up the Roman Empire, the government itself, those who made up the religious aspect of the worship of these false gods, they're human beings. They are serving the dragon. Whether they realize it or not, they're serving Satan. That's who they're serving. Well, this number of a man is 666. Not 777, which you would think, this fullness and this completion. And the number 3, when it's repeated over and over like that, usually carries about a sense of connection to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, a sense of deity, because God is 3 and yet he is 1. Well, here it's not deity, or it's not God. It's short of perfection, and yet it still has that connotation of it wants to be deity, it wants to be God. So you've got the dragon, and then who else do you have? The beast that is of the sea, and then the beast of the earth. Okay, this unholy trinity, I guess you could call it, of Satan and those who are serving him, the empire, and then the idolatry that is inextricably linked to the empire, all 3 of those working together, working in tandem to persecute the saints. That's what seems to be the idea of 666. The fact that it is short of perfection, it's not, and yet it wants to be, it's close, it wants to be, but also that 3-pronged concept from chapter 12 and chapter 13, the dragon and 2 beasts. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
So a comment and a question. First on the question, so you're referencing this verse back in verse 10 about ears to hear, let them hear. Is there something different like in Matthew 11:15, how Jesus says, if a man has ears to hear, let him hear? Is there something different in the original language that you're saying is not the same?
Yeah. According to what I've read, that the phrase itself, if anyone has an ear to hear, let him hear, that phrase itself is unique and only occurs 8 times. Now that's not to say
What's the difference?
that
the reception, I mean, Jesus would seem to be saying the same thing.
It is. It's the same concept that Jesus uses to say, you need to listen to what I say, especially as it pertains to the parables and things like that.
So it's just the exact verbiage?
It's the exact verbiage that's being referenced here. And that verbiage was unique to John, apparently, or at least specifically here in Revelation.
Right. So the comment is back to your statements about people trying to force this into today's times. I think a large part of that is man seems to have this ongoing knack for trying to figure out when the end of time is going to be. And that's tied so much to this book that if these events are now, then we know that the end of time is soon to come. But man has been doing that for hundreds of years and keeps being wrong, and God says you're not going to know that time. It's going to be like a thief in the night. And so they have to twist all the passages going back to the Old Testament prophets, the prophecies there, and do the exact same thing, twist them into how they want those to be foretelling. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. The understanding that Jesus said, what would the signs of the end times be? There would only be one sign. You remember what that Jesus said the sign would be? The sign of Jonah. That would be the only sign given. The fact that Jesus was buried, this is Jonah was in the belly of the great fish for 3 days. Jesus was buried for 3 days and was raised. That's the only sign. After that, there's nothing else. From that point on, at any time after he ascended, he could have come back at any point. And he could have come back in the 1st century, he could have come back in the 2nd century, but he hasn't. And the idea that there are signs or some way we can determine the end doesn't fit with what we're told. Because if there are signs, if there are ways for us to tell when the end is coming, that kind of defeats the point of a thief in the night. Does a thief in the night kind of declare the fact that he's coming? Does he send an email, a text saying, hey, I'm heading to your house at such and such a time?
Not usually.
Not usually. Okay? The whole idea is that it's completely by surprise, completely unexpected. And so that carries with it the sense, certainly, that, again, remember how all the way through Revelation, we've been saying we have to apply the things that we find in Revelation with the harmony of the Scriptures. Okay, they have to go together. Well, you can't just take Revelation and say this is all about the signs in complete contradiction to all the references to the fact that, no, there's not going to be any signs. No, these are signs, for sure. But they're signs specific to the imagery of these saints going through great hardship, great trial, which ultimately was a war against the Christians that they had to be faithful unto death. All right. We talk a little bit about the number 666, and we kind of talk a little bit about the idea of how that's associated and so forth, and the illusion perhaps of the dragon, the first beast, and the second beast, but that the number is not literal. It is not meant to be some kind of special code. It's not meant to be some sort of go back and look at all chapters that have 66 chapters, verse 6 of Isaiah or something like that. That's not what it's about. And it has, again, the numbers, especially of Revelation, as it connects to completion versus incomplete, perfection versus imperfection, and especially as it pertains to the fact that we're in the context of that which is of Satan, that which is evil, is contrasted with that which is pure and holy. All right, anything else through that? Let's cover our questions. Question 1, from where did the second beast come, and what does this seem to indicate? From the earth. Okay, it came from the earth, and what does that seem to indicate? Yeah, this is something that it's earthly, it's sensual, it's of Satan, and it's something that appeals to the flesh. It's something that appeals to the physical, and certainly idolatry, the ability to see your God, at least in some form, be able to touch your God, or be able to bow before your God, that sends a certain type of whether it's emotional or some kind of physical connection that people want to have. And certainly that seems to be the indication with this beast that is consistent with the idea of idolatry. Question 2, what seems to be represented by the appearance of a lamb yet having 2 horns?
With the lamb comes across both sides,
Yep.
but with the horns, it's deceptive, it hurts you.
All right, so you've got the innocent nature of a lamb, the kind of docile and seemingly harmless nature of a lamb, but these horns are something that can hurt, can cause harm. And certainly associated with idolatry especially, it's that idolatrous nature that even though it seems very nice and may seem very holy in some form or fashion, it's the exact opposite of that.
So Satan has the appearance of light, and it is no small thing that his disciples, apostles, would do the same.
Absolutely. Yeah. Satan can appear as an angel of light. Okay, he can pass himself off as something that's holy and righteous, either by taking God's word and twisting it, or through idolatry. Just the appeals of man's own desires through idolatry, he can do that. Question 3, what is suggested by the beast speaking with the voice of a dragon? There's really two aspects to that. Going back to chapter 12, there's the reference to Satan, okay, and that this would seem to certainly seem a connection to Satan, or the voice of Satan actually speaking through the idolatry. But there's also the sense of contrast between a lamb that is lowly and you would think nothing of it, and yet a dragon is fierce, and you kind of associate a dragon as being very angry and breathing fire and danger, and so those contrasts certainly are there for both of those. Question 4, are the signs that this beast performs literal miracles? Why or why not? Yeah, they're not real miracles. Just like the Magi of the Pharaoh, they attempted to copy through tricks and deception. Just like Simon had tricks and deception over the people of Samaria. It's not real miracles of Satan that Satan can perform. Question 5, what seems to be the best explanation of the identity of this second beast? The system of idolatry and those who served in that system. Okay, you have both references to the idea of the worship of these false gods, or worship of the emperors, but then also those who are part of that, making that happen. These priests and priestesses, the system itself, and those who serve that system would seem to be a part of it, because that was inextricably linked to the first beast, which is the empire. Question 6, what seems to be under consideration regarding the image to be worshipped? In a very broad sense, just false god. Okay, it's a false god, and that's what idolatry is all about. It's making some image of a false god, perhaps even more specific to emperor worship. And we talk a little bit about in the notes how that Domitian, he wanted to be referred to as emperor and lord, or emperor and god. He referred to himself as a living divus, or living deity. And so Domitian was really the first one to take that full step into that kind of deity realm. The emperors prior to Domitian, they dabbled a little bit in suggesting that they had connection to the gods, but it doesn't seem like prior to Domitian they actually went on full-blown I am a god, or I am deity, until Domitian did. Question 7, is the mark of the beast literal? And if not, what is it? Was the mark given to the 144,000 literal? No. No, there's that seal, that recognition that God knows those who are his, those who are serving him. In the same way, does God know exactly who serves Satan? Yes, he does. Okay, and it's something that is evident, and that's one of the key components here, that with both of these signs, or both of these marks, both the mark of God, or the seal of God, and the mark of the beast, these are something that is clearly seen. It is something clearly evident, and it's made evident by their life, by how they conduct themselves, by how they worship, by whom they worship. And so it's something that can be seen, something that's obvious. That's why it's on the forehead or the right hand. You can't hide it. Otherwise, it would be, on the back, or on the ankle or something where nobody's going to look. Somebody's trying to hide it, it's not going to be on the forehead or on the right hand. This is the exact opposite of that. Question 8, what physical impact does verse 17 suggest is coming or has come to the saints?
More persecution.
Yeah, persecution, but especially economic hardship. Yeah, okay, those who aren't killed through this kind of purging, I guess, of those who won't worship the beast and his image, they're going to face economic trial, economic hardship. And it's going to be very difficult for them to do anything, much less those who ran businesses or tried to do business with these guilds and things like that. Question 9, what seems to be the best explanation for the meaning of the number 666? And we just talked.
1-6 is bad enough, but you're just so deep in sin, you're completely overtaken. You get extra 6s.
Yeah. If 6 is incomplete, imperfection, it's associated with the concept of sin, then triple sixes certainly suggest beyond the depth of sin, I guess you could say. It certainly associates with directly Satan and these beasts, and the fact that those serving these beasts, this is their mark, this is their number, and it's on their forehead and it's on their right hand. It is this imperfection being associated with Satan as opposed to perfection being associated with God.
You have a three-dimensional effect. It's complete.
Yeah.
I mean, that's,
Yeah.
In space, that's
3 dimensions. Yeah. There's a fullness sense in that way. Yeah. All right. Let's go to chapter 14. We won't be able to get very far here in chapter 14, but we will be able to start. To start off with, I wanted to read. So this is chapter 14 is about the Lamb and the 144,000. And the 144,000, we're talking about the same 144,000 of Revelation 7. And I think that's very important to note, because Revelation 7 helps us to kind of put this number into context and to help keep it consistent, what we're describing. So here in verse 1, then I looked and behold a Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven, like the voice of many waters, and like the voice of loud thunder. And I heard the sound of harpists playing their harps. They sang as it were a new song before the throne, before the 4 living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. These are the ones who were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. These are the ones who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These were redeemed from among men, being firstfruits to God and to the Lamb. I think it's really interesting, because to start off with, you've got these things happening, and then in verse 5, there's nothing, no deceit found in their mouth. They're without fault before the throne of God. And then going forward into verse 6, you've got these, ultimately what we end up having is 6 angels total, but there's 3 mentioned in that first part of chapter 14, then 3 more. But here you've got, in verse 5, almost off as an aside, you have the Lamb and his 144,000. And they're on Mount Zion. And these are the pure, these are the holy people. And then everything else that happens apart from them. Now, it's important for us to remember that the imagery being used, people read Mount Zion, and what's the immediate physical connection they try to make there? Jerusalem. Okay, Mount Zion, and the temple specifically being built on the what they call the Temple Mount, which was on Mount Zion. Mount Zion is referenced in Old Testament, especially the Old Testament poetry, like in the Psalms, and references to going up to the temple to worship God on Mount Zion. But the sense of that physical association to Judaism, to the temple, to Jerusalem itself. People go here and they say, see, Jesus is going to, when he comes back, he's going to stand on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. And then he's going to reestablish the kingdom then. And that's when we start getting into millennialism and premillennium, postmillennialism. But the idea of a 1,000-year reign on earth, that Jesus is going to establish the kingdom then. It's going to be a physical kingdom, very, very similar to the same thoughts that the Jews had 2,000 years ago about the kingdom and their interpretation of the prophecies. In a lot of ways, that has not stopped. Okay, that thought process hasn't quit. But notice, again, if we're talking about Mount Zion, if we're not talking about physical, because notice these 144,000, what type of people are they? In verse 4, they haven't been defiled with women. So if we're going to take Mount Zion literally, then these holy people they're not married, they're virgins. These are individuals who've never had that type of relationship. Those are the only ones who are going to be on Mount Zion. That has to be literal too, doesn't it?
Sure.
Yeah. If you're going to take Mount Zion literally, then we have to take the rest of it literally. Now. Huh? And they're all men. Absolutely. They're all men. And notice in verse 5, no deceit was found in their mouth. So they don't lie. These are only men. They're virgins. And so those are the only ones who are on Mount Zion. And somehow that has to have some kind of physical representation. And I suggest to you that just like in every other piece of imagery we've had so far, this is representative and symbolic. It is not literal. It is symbolic of that which is of God versus that which is of Satan. So next week we will break down this first part of Revelation 14 and see what is actually happening here and associate it with what the rest of Revelation says. Thank you, everybody.